The city of New York has always been a place of ambition, power, and secrets. Behind its dazzling skyline and fast-paced life, the city harbors stories that are far more complex than they appear. This is the story of two men, once brothers in arms, now bitter enemies locked in a silent war. A battle waged not just in the streets, but within their very souls. David Coleman is the embodiment of success. With a commanding presence, designer suits, and a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, he seems untouchable. He rubs shoulders with the elite, attends the most exclusive galas, and is featured in business magazines as one of the youngest self-made entrepreneurs in the city. But beneath the surface, David harbors a past that refuses to be buried. A past that's about to catch up with him in the most unexpected way. On the opposite side of the spectrum is Eric Walsh. Once David's closest friend, Eric spent the last 15 years rotting in prison, betrayed by the very person he trusted the most. He had taken the fall for a heist that made David rich, believing that his friend would come back for him. But David never did. Now, Eric is out, hardened by years behind bars, and fueled by a singular purpose: revenge. While David enjoys the spoils of his deception, he carries a burden that no amount of money can erase. Every night, he sheds his billionaire persona and becomes Joe, a homeless man who roams the streets of Manhattan, blending in with those who have nothing. It's a strange ritual, a self-imposed punishment for the sins of his past. He doesn't beg or steal. He merely observes, trying to understand what it truly means to be stripped of power, to be invisible. But Eric is watching. He's been tracking David for months, unraveling the double life of his old friend. He knows about Joe, he knows about the guilt, and most importantly, he knows exactly how to use it against him. This isn't just about getting even. It's about dismantling David's entire world, piece by piece. As the game begins, another player unknowingly enters the board. Rebecca Miller, a young and ambitious lawyer working for a homeless assistance program, stumbles upon Joe one night. There's something about him that doesn't add up. His posture, his speech, the way he carries himself. He's not like the others. And as she digs deeper, she realizes that she's about to uncover a truth far more dangerous than she ever anticipated. New York is a city of second chances, but not everyone gets one. And in this tale of betrayal, deception, and redemption, the question remains: who will come out on top when the final card is played? David and Eric had been inseparable since childhood. They weren't just best friends. They were brothers in everything but blood. From their earliest days growing up in Brooklyn, they had each other's backs. Whether it was covering for each other at school, fighting off bullies, or dreaming about escaping the rough streets, they were a team. Nothing could break them apart. Or so David thought. By their early 20s, their paths began to diverge. David, ambitious and determined, worked hard to leave his past behind. He clawed his way up the ranks in the cutthroat world of real estate, eventually building a successful career. Eric, on the other hand, always sought the easy way out. He dabbled in shady deals, quick money schemes, and low-level cons that often landed him in trouble. David never judged him outright, but deep down, he knew their lives were heading in different directions. Then came the favor that changed everything. One evening, Eric showed up unannounced at David's luxury apartment, wearing a grin that David had seen far too many times. The grin that usually preceded a bad idea. Eric had hit a rough patch and needed a job. He pleaded with David to pull some strings, promising that this time, he'd go straight. Against his better judgment, David agreed. He secured Eric an entry-level position at his firm, a chance to rebuild his life. At first, everything seemed fine. Eric showed up on time, kept his head down, and worked hard. But soon, little things started to feel off. It started with missing files, misreported figures, minor errors that David brushed off as careless mistakes. Then, David overheard a hushed conversation between Eric and a client in the office hallway. It wasn't just small talk. The tone was secretive, the words vague but suggestive. David's gut twisted. He wanted to believe that Eric had changed, but a nagging suspicion told him otherwise. The final straw came when David's accountant flagged an irregularity in one of their financial reports. Money was disappearing, small amounts at first, then larger sums. The transactions were expertly hidden, But one name kept appearing in the background: Eric Walsh. David couldn't ignore the signs anymore. His best friend, the man he had trusted like a brother, was stealing from him. The realization hit him like a freight train. But instead of confronting Eric immediately, David decided to wait. He needed proof. He needed to know just how deep this betrayal ran. And so, the game began. Eric walked out of prison with nothing but the clothes on his back and a raging fire in his chest. He had spent 15 long years behind bars, replaying the betrayal over and over in his mind. David, his best friend, his brother in crime, had set him up and walked away with everything: the money, the life, the future. And now, it was Eric's turn to take everything back. The world had changed while he was locked away. New York looked different, brighter, bigger, colder. He had no friends, no connections, no plan, but one thing kept him moving: revenge. Finding David wasn't easy. The man had wiped his past clean, building a new identity from scratch. But Eric knew how to track people. It took months, but eventually he found him. David Coleman, real estate mogul, multimillionaire, a man who walked through the world with confidence, as if his past had never existed. Eric spent weeks watching him from the shadows, learning his routines. The penthouse apartment in Manhattan, the chauffeur-driven black Mercedes, the elite business meetings, the charity galas, the fine dining. David had it all. But then, something strange happened. Every night, like clockwork, David left his high-rise, but instead of heading to another luxurious event, he vanished into the underbelly of the city. He would enter a grimy public restroom or an alleyway and emerge looking different. Dressed in ragged clothes, with a scruffy beard and dirt smeared on his face, David transformed into a completely different person, a homeless man. Eric was stunned. What the hell was this? A scam? A twisted game? For days, he followed David, watching him blend in with the homeless community. He begged for change, ate in shelters, and slept in abandoned buildings. It wasn't an act. David lived a double life. But why? Eric's anger grew. This was a man who had stolen millions. A man who lived in a penthouse while he, his supposed best friend, rotted in a cell. And yet, here he was, choosing to live like a nobody. It didn't make sense. But Eric wasn't here to understand. He was here to destroy. David thought he had erased his past, thought he had outrun his sins. But Eric was back. And this time, there was no escape. Eric wasn't just going to confront David. No, that would be too easy, too quick. He wanted David to feel the same level of betrayal, the same burning rage that had consumed him for 15 years. So, he planned. The first step was infiltration. He needed to get close to David without being recognized. A disguise was necessary, but unlike David's carefully crafted, homeless persona, Eric chose something more fitting. He became the kind of person David would trust. After a few weeks of observation, Eric learned that David was involved in several charity projects, one of which focused on helping the homeless. Through some careful manipulation, he managed to volunteer at one of the foundations David donated to. He kept a low profile, working in the background, making sure never to cross paths directly with David. But he was always watching. Then came the next phase: psychological warfare. Eric began spreading whispers in the homeless community. Rumors that a certain Joe wasn't who he seemed to be, that he was playing a game, that he was mocking the real struggles of the people around him. The effect was subtle at first. Suspicious glances, uneasy interactions. The trust David had built with the homeless community was starting to crack. But Eric wasn't done. One night, he followed David to a shelter and, under a different alias, introduced himself. "You new around here?" he asked, acting as if he was just another guy trying to survive. David, always guarded, hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just trying to get by." Eric pretended to trust him. He shared fake stories, played the role of a desperate man. And over the course of a few weeks, he made David think they were friends. Then came the real trap. Eric planted evidence, just small things at first. A rumor about a homeless man stealing from others. A missing wallet here, a false accusation there. Slowly, the people David interacted with daily started to distrust him. One night, Eric made his final move. He staged an argument between David and another man at the shelter. With a little push, that argument turned into a full-blown fight. And when the cops showed up, Eric made sure David looked like the aggressor. David was arrested. For the first time in years, he was powerless. And Eric? He was just getting started. David sat in the cold, cramped holding cell, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline rush of the fight. He had been in tough situations before, boardroom battles, high-stakes negotiations. But this was different. This was a world he had spent years trying to escape, a world where power meant nothing unless you could fight for it. His mind raced. How had things spiraled so quickly? Then it hit him. The signs had been there all along. The misplaced distrust from the homeless community, the staged argument, the way the cops arrived at exactly the right moment. Someone had set him up, and he knew exactly who. Eric. Meanwhile, Eric was savoring his victory. Watching David fall from his throne was more satisfying than he had ever imagined. But he wasn't done. The arrest was just the beginning. Eric wanted to take away everything. David's business, his reputation, his entire existence. With David locked up, Eric made his next move. He had gathered enough dirt on David's real estate empire to start a full-scale investigation. Using an anonymous tip, he sent evidence of David's fraudulent dealings to the media. Leaked documents, insider testimonies. Eric had spent months preparing for this. The fallout was immediate. Headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Real estate mogul David Coleman exposed in shocking double-life scandal, and the homeless imposter, billionaire's secret identity revealed. David's company stocks plummeted overnight. Investors pulled out. Lawsuits flooded in. The empire he had built on stolen money and deception was collapsing. But Eric wanted one final blow. The final confrontation. When David was released on bail, he found himself a pariah. His name was tarnished, his assets frozen, and the people he once controlled had turned their backs on him. He had nothing. That's when he got the message. A handwritten note slipped under his apartment door. Meet me at the old warehouse on 34th Street. Midnight. Come alone. David knew it was Eric. With nothing left to lose, he went. The warehouse was eerily silent, the air thick with dust and the scent of rusted metal. A single hanging bulb flickered above, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. Eric was waiting. You look like hell, Eric said, smirking. Not the billionaire I remember. David clenched his fists. You wanted revenge. You got it. What now? You gonna kill me? Eric stepped closer, his expression unreadable. I could, but that's too easy. See, I wanted you to feel what I felt. Betrayed. Trapped. Forgotten. David exhaled sharply. So what? You ruined my life. Then what? You think this makes us even? Eric pulled out a briefcase, opened it, and pushed it toward David. Inside was cash, millions of it. David's eyes widened. What the hell is this? It's your money, Eric said. Or at least, it's what's left of it. The rest? Gone. You have a choice. Take this and disappear, or stay and face the consequences of everything you've done. David hesitated. For the first time in his life, he had no power, no control. And Eric? He had all of it. This was the ultimate revenge. David sat in silence, staring at the briefcase full of cash. The warehouse felt colder than before, or maybe it was just the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had spent years building an empire, living a double life, and now, because of Eric, he had nothing. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just Eric's doing. This was karma. Eric leaned against a rusted metal pillar, watching David's expression shift. Not what you expected, huh? He said, arms crossed. I could have left you rotting in that cell, or worse. But I want you to suffer the way I did. David finally looked up. And what happens if I take the money and leave? Eric smirked. Then you disappear. No more David Coleman, no more real estate mogul. You become the nobody you pretended to be all these years. David exhaled sharply. It wasn't just about the money. It was about his identity. If he walked away now, he'd be admitting defeat. He'd be accepting the fact that everything he had built was a lie. But what choice did he have? Meanwhile, the world outside the warehouse was still reeling from the scandal. David's company had collapsed overnight. His former business partners distanced themselves, and the media was relentless. News channels replayed footage of his arrest, reporters dug into his past, and social media was flooded with memes mocking his fall from grace. Rebecca Miller, the lawyer who had once tried to help Joe, was watching the chaos unfold from her office. She had suspected something was off about him, but never in a million years had she imagined this. A billionaire disguised as a homeless man? It sounded like something out of a movie. But Rebecca wasn't done with David yet. She pulled up the file she had been working on, evidence that David's company had committed fraud, evicted low-income tenants, and manipulated property values for years. With the scandal already destroying his reputation, this was the final nail in the coffin. She made her decision. David Coleman wouldn't just lose his fortune. He was going to prison. Back at the warehouse, David finally made his move. He pushed the briefcase back toward Eric. "Keep it," he said, his voice firm. Eric's eyes narrowed. "What?" "I'm done running." For the first time in his life, David was ready to face the consequences. He had spent years living in fear of the past catching up to him. Now that it had, he realized he didn't want to escape. He wanted to make things right. Eric scoffed. "You think turning yourself in makes up for what you did?" "No," David admitted, "but it's a start." He turned and walked away, leaving the money and his old life behind. Days later, David's surrender made headlines. He was charged with fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The court case was swift, and despite his attempts to cooperate, the judge wasn't lenient. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Eric watched the trial from a distance, satisfied but strangely hollow. He had won, but revenge didn't feel as sweet as he had imagined. Still, he walked away knowing one thing. David Coleman was no longer above the law. David sat on the edge of his prison cot, staring at the gray walls that had become his reality. The world outside had moved on without him, and for the first time in years, he had nothing. No wealth, no influence, no carefully constructed identity to hide behind. He was simply David Coleman, a man who had spent his life running from his past, only to be caught by it in the end. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt something unexpected. Relief. For so long, he had been two people, David the billionaire and Joe the forgotten man. He had lived in constant fear of being exposed, of losing everything. But now, with his secrets out in the open, there was nothing left to fear. He had faced the consequences, and strangely enough, it gave him a sense of peace. Outside the prison walls, the world continued to talk about his downfall. Some people saw him as nothing more than a fraud, a con man who had tricked his way to success. Others were fascinated by the duality of his life, debating whether his time spent living as a homeless man was an act of redemption or just another deception. Rebecca Miller, the lawyer who had exposed him, wasn't sure how to feel. She had built her career fighting for justice, and in many ways, taking down David Coleman had been one of her biggest victories. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that David wasn't like the other criminals she had fought against. He wasn't heartless. He wasn't cruel. He was just broken. And that made her wonder, could a man like him ever truly change? Meanwhile, Eric Walsh had disappeared. With his revenge complete, there was nothing left to keep him in New York. He took the money David had refused and left the city behind, vowing to never look back. He had won. But like David, he couldn't shake the feeling that his victory felt hollow. Maybe in the end, neither of them had really won. As months passed, David slowly adjusted to prison life. He spent his time reading, reflecting, and, most importantly, learning how to live with himself. He began volunteering for prison programs, helping other inmates who had come from rough backgrounds. He used his business knowledge to teach financial literacy classes, guiding those who had once been like him, young, desperate, and willing to do anything to survive. For the first time, he was using his skills for something good. 1 year later, David received a visitor. Rebecca Miller sat across from him, her sharp lawyer's gaze studying him carefully. "You don't look like the same man I took down," she admitted. David chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe I'm not." She slid a folder across the table. "I've been doing some digging. Your company may have been corrupt, but I also found records of anonymous donations you made to shelters, food banks, and rehabilitation centers over the years. Even when you were living a lie, you were trying to do something good. David looked at the papers, then back at Rebecca. What's your point? Rebecca sighed. My point is, maybe you deserve a second chance. David frowned. I don't expect one. Maybe not. But if you keep proving you've changed, the parole board might. David nodded slowly. He didn't know if he believed in redemption, but he did know one thing. He was no longer the man who had built his empire on lies. He was no longer the man who had betrayed his best friend. For the first time in his life, David Coleman was ready to face the future, no matter what it held.